All right, so let's start with coding and what we're actually doing. You've read a bunch of stuff, but really, what is a code? The easiest answer is it's some word or a phrase, which is great, but what does that mean? And specifically, what do those words or those phrases mean? When we're coding, we want to have some word or phrase that captures an idea. It's a representative of what is happening in the data. That is so vague, and this is why qualitative is hard. You'll get it as you practice, I promise. What we're trying to do is go from our raw data, so all of our transcripts. Coding is the first process. So how can we collapse some of the ideas that we keep seeing throughout the data into kind of a chunk? And later, the next step is to start creating bigger chunks and bigger chunks, which go into our themes, and then those lead to kind of our meaning and assumptions and interpretations. So with every pass, we're going further from the data into larger ideas of what's happening. But everything starts with our raw data. If we don't see it here, we can't see it out here. So that's our first step, is to start finding chunks that go together. So these things keep coming up in our transcript, so we're going to code it as something. And there's two major kinds of codes that we're going to talk about. One of them is called emergent. It's also called open coding. This is also grounded theory coding. But the idea here is that we have no preconceived notion. We are just reading the interview or the focus group or looking at the observation, whatever your data is. And we're seeing what stands out specifically to our research questions, but like, what are they talking about? What are the things that keep coming up? So it comes directly from the data. A priori coding is also called structured coding, and this one is decided beforehand. So we come up with several codes before we ever start this process. This usually actually happens in your proposal and methodology sections. And these are based on some literature, frameworks, your research questions, standards, experiences, whatever you're looking for specifically that you know you're looking for before you ever read a transcript. Those are your a priori codes. So things to consider that we're going to keep coming back to is, where do the codes come from? You're going to always have to defend where your codes came from. They can come from the data itself, they can come from some literature or something, but you're always going to have to defend this. And then the second one, which we're going to keep coming back to throughout the rest of the course, is how do we know it's real? So Saldana, I love this article. And they say that coding is a cyclical act. And that is so true, that you can't just read it once, code, and you're done. You're constantly going back to it. You're going to read it. You're going to see something. Your teammate is going to see something different. So you're going to go back and be like, oh, I do see what my teammate saw. And they're going to do the same. And you're going to argue about it and debate it. And is this real? Is it the same thing? Is it different? Do we collapse these? Oh, there's so much that we constantly are going back to. You don't read the transcript once, and you don't get it right the first attempt. So the first cycle or the first pass of coding is very dynamic. It's a process where you are constantly going to change it, to modify it, to perfect it. And then you go back the second time and it gets cleaner. And you go back the third time and it gets even cleaner. So I want to take a step back and I want to compare quant and qual for just a second, just to kind of help you get a feel, especially if you are coming from one of my quant classes. What the first step with quantitative data is to clean it. So we get this data set, we look at it, we say, is it arranged the way we need? Is it usable? Is it clean? Do we need to organize anything into variables like creating mean scores? That's the first step. The qualitative coding is kind of the equivalent. So we're starting with the raw data and we're starting to clean it up into smaller usable chunks, just like when we're organizing data into variables. We do not talk about codes in the same way as variables though, so don't get those confused. When it comes to quantitative analysis, it's very mathematical. You're doing a t-test or a chi-square or correlation, and your categories are defined in advance. We already know what the variables are that we're looking for. And we organize all of our thoughts and writings based on the hypothesis testing and the mathematical relationships that we're looking at. Well, with qualitative analysis, it is very descriptive. This is looking at the categories that emerge from the data, and that when we look at our codes and how the codes come together, and then we organize our thoughts and our writing into descriptive themes, maybe mini stories, by different research questions, but it's not organized in the same way. So the writing's going to look different as well. But the point of coding is to make analysis easier. This is the first step. So let me give you a quick preview of what analysis we're going to be talking about so that you can see where we're going as we start coding. So qualitative analysis is going to be summarizing these big ideas and concepts that you're interested in. So we'll start asking questions like, how much was coded? How frequently did this code appear? And from what sources did certain codes appear? So if we only have a code that was talked about a couple of times and there wasn't a whole lot to say about it and it was only from one source, that's probably not a real code. But if we have a code that was talked about a lot, like they didn't just mention it, they sat there and talked about it, and it was talked about a lot, and it was talked about by everybody, now I'm starting to see maybe more of a real code. That's a really important code, and that might lead me to a bigger theme. So again, like we saw in that chart, we're starting the closest to the data, and then we're going to just keep collapsing and building into patterns where we can see these categories or clusters grouping together into these bigger themes. And those lead to our findings. Themes and findings tend to be interchangeable words here. So we see this right here again. So we start with our data, we're coding it, we're going to collapse things into bigger ideas, until we get kind of to this larger themes and categories, and that's how we're going to end up organizing the rest of our data and writing. And within analysis, we're constantly looking for confirming and disconfirming examples. We have to actively look for disconfirming examples. Just because somebody didn't talk about it doesn't mean it wasn't important to them. But if they talked about it differently than everybody else, that's something that we need to note and look deeper into. And of course, there's also the whole idea of validity and reliability, which we're going to be calling trustworthiness. And we'll do some inter-rater reliability towards the end of the class. But I want you to be thinking about this as you're coding. Would a reasonable person with a similar background have inferred the same thing from this information that they're reading and call it the same thing I did? Meaning, could a reasonable person see the same thing I did? So that way you're not putting your own complete bias on it and saying, well, this is what I think because my background says X, Y, Z. We have to be coding in a way that a reasonable person, so anybody else could see the same thing. We'll come back to this a little bit later as we continue through our analysis.